Welcome to the 273rd meeting of the New York Comics and Picture Story Symposium. That's a lecture series out of the illustration program at Parsons, the new school. I'm Ben Katchor, a teacher in that program. Our guest tonight is DANNY FINGEROTH. DANNY was a longtime editorial director of Marvel's Spider-Man comics line and a writer of comics featuring Spider-Man, Iron Man, and other iconic Marvel characters. He's also the author of 2 books, including Superman on the Couch, What Superheroes Really Tell Us About Ourselves and Society, and Disguised as Clark Kent, Jews, Comics, and the Creation of the Superhero. DANNY is a consultant to the Will Eisner Studios and to the traveling Marvel Universe of Superheroes exhibition that has set attendance records in Seattle and Philadelphia. He has spoken and taught on comics-related topics at Columbia University, the Smithsonian Institute, and Parsons, the new school. And now I'm going to turn it over to DANNY.
This is it. It's not quite. I'm destroying the illusion. I'm not really in Doctor Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum or in the Spirit's hideout. But this is the book. It's not quite. There we go. You'll see. You'll have plenty of time to look at the cover later. So I'm going to read from it. Ben, the sound is coming through clear?
Yep.
Okay. I'm going to read excerpts from a couple of chapters. This is from chapter 9, Creating Characters. Marvel's achievement in the 1960s wasn't to publish one great story or even many great stories. It was to create a phenomenon that for many lived up to the hype surrounding it. Like few popular culture touchstones, the Beatles come to mind, Marvel kept on living up to its hype for far longer than most explosions of pop culture. Stan Lee, in the first era of Marvel's 1960s success, was able, after helping create it, to recognize, exploit, and maintain for a full decade this phenomenon's first incarnation, and to plant the seeds for it to regularly renew itself. So then whoever really invented the specific first wave of Marvel characters, however the stories were developed, there was one consistent, singular, call it omniscient voice telling you the stories, and as importantly, welcoming you into the world of Marvel. That voice had a name in the real world and in the magazine's pages. That name was Stan Lee. It was the voice that told you, starting with its 3rd issue, that Fantastic Four was the world's greatest comic magazine. It was the voice that introduced issue 15 of Amazing Spider-Man by saying, on the first page, lettered inside a giant arrow pointing at Spider-Man's head, for any of you who may have been living in another galaxy for the past 2 years, will explain that this is Spider-Man. And this is certainly the most exciting Spidey adventure we've ever presented since the last one. It's got villains, heroes, action, a mishmash of everything, and it's told in the Marvel manner. Enough said. It's the voice that in the same issue listed the credits thus. Written by Stan Lee because we couldn't afford Mickey Spillane. Illustrated by Steve Ditko because Picasso was out of town. Lettered by Art Simic because his name fits the space. It's the voice that on the cover of issue 16, wherein Spider-Man first meets Daredevil, advised, warning, if you don't say this is one of the greatest issues you've ever read, we may never talk to you again. This omniscient, fourth wall breaking, friendly, self-deprecating voice was the voice of Marvel. It was written as the editorial we, and portrayed as the collective voice of Stan and Jack Kirby, or Stan and Steve Ditko, or the voice of the entire Marvel bullpen. It was, of course, though, the voice of Stan Lee. Whoever it was, In letters page responses and special announcements, he could say things like this from Spider-Man 20. One thing we get a kick out of is the occasional fan who writes in to demand that we give Sonny Steve some more strips to draw. Poor old darling Ditko does about 20 pages of Spidey each month, plus 10 pages of Doctor Strange, plus 10 pages of the Hulk, and he still finds time to argue with Stan for a few hours each week. Was this a witty remark? An accurate description of Lee and Ditko's relationship? Both? The voice could also say things like this from Spider-Man 21. We haven't seen the sketches for Spider-Man 22 yet, but Stan and Steve have been walking around chuckling to themselves and patting each other on the back for days. So they must have something pretty special cooked up. Anyway, when these two characters go to town, how bad can it be? This was a remarkably clever way to say that they, by this point, most likely just Ditko, hadn't plotted the issue yet. It created the illusion that someone other than Stan was reporting on those wonderful guys, Stan and Steve, and that Stan and Steve were such great pals who so enjoyed their collaborations that they walked around patting each other on the back for days. And by golly, it did make you want to come back next issue and see what they'd come up with. Or take this special announcement from the letters page of Fantastic Four 23. We needed a name for the villain of X-Men 3, and Stan and Jack were kicking a few around when a boy delivering sandwiches walked in and jokingly said, "He looks like a big blob, call him the Blob." Stan and Jack looked at each other and said, "Why not?" In one paragraph, Lee switches from being the teller of the anecdote to being one of the people being told about, to doing an apparent mind meld with Kirby, where the combined Stan Jack is willing to take advice from a regular working stiff, a boy delivering sandwiches no less. Did this story really happen? Did the delivery boy get to name a villain? Were Stan and Jack actually there to agree that it was the perfect name? And of course, where's the moment where editor Stan or publisher Martin Goodman had to approve a decision made by the writer and artist? This is the same voice that can also get plenty serious, as in the letters page to Fantastic Four 24, when it declares, "Many readers say they don't like referring to our mags as comic mags, but we must disagree. It is our intention here at Marvel to produce comics which are so well written and well drawn that they'll elevate this entire field in the mind of the public. After all, comic magazines are an art form, as creative and enjoyable as any other." Stating this thought this way was a major step. In an era before widespread consideration of comic books as art, and less than a decade after Frederick Wortham's Seduction of the Innocent, no one inside comics, and few outside it, thought of it as anything beyond craft, and fairly low-level craft at that. Only Will Eisner had spoken on the record of comics as art, and that was in 1941. Lee's bold statement was followed lower down on the same letters page while signing off for the issue with, "And so till next issue, remember, we're working night and day to bring you the best in story and art and to make you proud of the comic magazines you read." Imagine this voice, not this voice, Stan's voice, in this intimate medium, making you laugh, giving you insider stories, ballyhooing the very issue you're reading, promoting the upcoming issue, adding a narratively unnecessary but fun as hell verbiage and wordplay, extending your time reading the comic, so also adding to its value as entertainment time purchased, and complimenting you on how great you are for simply reading, and of course, enjoying, not to mention buying, the comic. This was unprecedented. Your parents, your older siblings, your non-comic loving friends, they may all make fun of, or simply just not understand, the hold these gaudy pamphlets have on you. But the voice of Marvel does. The entity that is Marvel does. Stan Lee does. Stan Lee had become the literal and figurative voice of Marvel. Now I'm going to read it apart from chapter 11, which is titled Boom, Boom, Boom. Baby boomer navel gazing is beyond a cliche, and yet there seems to be no better way to explain Marvel's popularity and Stan Lee's '60s celebrity than as a factor of boomer culture. A significant number of kids who were hooked by Marvel from early Fantastic Four and Spider-Man and the rest grew from childhood to adolescence, or from adolescence to adulthood during the period from 1961 to the late 60s, and maintained an interest in Marvel's characters and creators over those years. Of course, most adolescents dropped comics, but a fair number now did stay with them, including college students. And as Kirby was bursting boundaries of concepts and vision, Lee was doing the same with writing, editing, and promotion. Certainly, the fact that both men had boomer children could well have been a factor in what they were thinking and storytelling about. They had literal skin in the game. The world in which their children were growing up was knocking constantly at their doors. Sex, drugs, and rock and roll wasn't just a glib slogan to them. They were realities that their kids faced daily at school and on the streets, and for that matter, on TV and in the movies. It was what everybody's kids faced. There were 70 million boomers in a country of around 200 million. And while Steve Ditko was neither a boomer nor the father of one, he did seem to have never lost touch with the Johnstown high school teenager he had been, or with the timeless verities of adolescence. So the audience that had been in grade school so the audience that had been in grade school in the early and mid 60s was now heading for college or Vietnam or the Peace Corps or Canada or Haight-Ashbury or a factory or an office. And many members of that audience kept up with Marvel's comics. And many of them wanted to know what Stan Lee thought about what was going on in the world. Why? Largely because Lee had happened upon a personal connection with Marvel's readers, and Lee was synonymous with Marvel. Stan Lee, an actual person with a vulnerable public persona, was the voice and face of Marvel in a time when corporate mascots Superman and Batman were the voice and face of DC, and no one was really the voice and face of any other comics company. So it didn't really matter to most readers what DC editors Julius Schwartz or Bob Kanigher or Mort Weisinger thought about the issues of the day. Those men, whatever their real-life personalities, didn't think of themselves as publicists or cheerleaders or spokespersons. Their job was to put out entertaining comic books that sold well enough for them to keep on putting out entertaining comic books that sold well enough. Stan Lee had decided that his job description was something else. A child of the Great Depression and of the peregrinations of the comics business, he seemed to instinctively realize that his desperation move to provide Marvel with a friendly face also gave him a launching pad for becoming a celebrity who, surprisingly, probably even to himself, had opinions and feelings and passions that related both directly and tangentially to a medium and a company that he thought he had long ago ceased caring about. Lee took to this new celebrity like the proverbial duck to water. He developed a new look that involved fashionable suits, a neatly trimmed beard, and a stylish, well-sculpted toupee. It had become clear that so long as Marvel was prominent, he would be prominent. And if Marvel ever lost its cachet, or if it decided it didn't need Stan Lee anymore, he was now in a position to take his celebrity and do with it whatever he felt necessary and appropriate. Sure, he was in the comics business, but he was now also in the larger entertainment business. Most importantly, he was in the Stan Lee business, and that, it would turn out, would be a very interesting business. It was a business that would be the key to pretty much everything professionally and often personally that would happen to him for the rest of his life. If there was ever someone in the right place at the right time with the right skill set, experience, and personality to make the most of the possibilities presented to him and created by him, it was Stan Lee. And that is the end of my reading from the book. Thank you for sticking around. Ben, do you want to go through the PowerPoint? I had a...
Sure.
version of it here, but let's start the slideshow.
Yeah, I was just waiting. Somebody emailed me, wanted to get in, but I don't see them trying to get on. So,
Okay.
no, I don't see them. So maybe we should forget about it. Once I start this, I think it's going to be hard for me to.
Okay.
You see it? Is the
I see
first
it.
slide up?
Yeah. Is
Great.
it filling the screen? Let's see. Okay. All right. This is the cover of the book. This is the name of the book and the name of tonight's event. Or anyway, I guess we can go to the next one. This is from the inside cover of a comic called Fantasy Masterpieces that reprinted a lot of the monster and science fiction stories that Marvel had been doing in the 50s and 60s. And this is the first image that a lot of people of my generation, or probably anybody reading the comics, had of Stan. So kind of that, again, some kind of withered adult, a kind of hip but not too hip kind of guy, kind of like your dad or your uncle, not trying to be a kid. He's there in a tie and a jacket. He's got that Frank Sinatra hat, which at the time we didn't know was because I think he was embarrassed about his receding hairline. So I think the role model there really was that kind of Rat Pack cool, that Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis kind of hip 60s look, except he knew more about comics than Frank Sinatra did. We can go to the next one. So that's just a close-up of the same image. But for years, that was really pretty much anybody outside the business, anybody who was a fan reading them knew of what Stan. And it's a great affable image. It was really the perfect image for Marvel. Next, going back in his life, that is, I guess if Stan was born in 1922, he's maybe, 9 or 10 years old. So this is probably around 1930, 31, right? And the baby is Larry Lieber, his brother, and Larry is 9 years younger. So let's say Larry looks like he's maybe a year old and Stan's probably 10. So it's probably 1932. That's Jack Lieber, Stan's father, and Celia, his mother, somewhere, maybe in a park maybe near Washington Heights or in Central Park, but somewhere in New York. Next. That's Stan, again, around the same age. He was living in Washington Heights, and I think he got this bicycle for his birthday when he was like 10 or 12. And it's a big part of Stan's personal mythology that his parents couldn't afford it. I think they had to borrow money from a relative to buy him this bike, and suddenly his whole world was opened. He could drive across the brand new George Washington Bridge and go to New Jersey. Who can imagine such a thing? What liberation? And buy hot dogs and bike around. So this was a major event and a major metaphor in Stan's childhood. Next, please. That's Stan's high school picture from the DeWitt Clinton high school yearbook. Clinton had a big part in Stan's mythology. I think for a lot of that early generation of comics creators whose families either couldn't afford to send them to college or who weren't academically inclined, high school was a big thing. Excuse me. So Stan went to DeWitt Clinton, as did Bob Kane and Bill Finger, who created Batman, and Irwin Hazen, famous for Dondi and Wonder Woman. Also James Baldwin and Patty Chayefsky, and either Lerner or Lowe, I forget. But I mean, that was like, there were 3 high schools that were like the Harvard, Yale, and Princeton for comic books. There was DeWitt Clinton. There was the High School of Music and Art, where Al Jaffe and Harvey Kurtzman and a lot of the Mad people went. And there was Glenville High School in Cleveland, which is where Siegel and Schuster, who created Superman, went. DeWitt Clinton, the reason I have not mentioned any women or girls who graduated there, was an all-boys school. There was a comparable Bronx school that I'm blanking on the name of, Walton. I don't know if they had as illustrious an alumni list. And Bronx Science, I guess, existed but hadn't had opened in 1938. So this was where anybody, I don't think you had to take a test to go to DeWitt Clinton, but just because of the demographic of all these immigrant Jewish and Italian and Irish and Black kids, it was a competitive school. It was famous for its sports teams, although Stan was not involved in any sports teams. But I think this was a major part of Stan's development and growing up. Next, please, Ben. So Stan got out of DeWitt Clinton and had a few odd jobs in the New York area. A lot of them were just schlepping stuff or doing kind of grunt work. He had a job writing obituaries, which depressed him, writing obituaries about people who were still alive, and a number of other jobs. He was an usher at a movie theater in Times Square, where he tripped as he was leading Eleanor Roosevelt to her seat. I think it was the Rivoli Theater. This guy, Martin Goodman, was Stan's cousin by marriage. So while I don't think they were especially close before Stan came to work at what was called Timely Comics, afterwards their relationship became enmeshed and complicated. Martin Goodman was Stan's mother's cousin's husband. So not exactly a super close relationship. They see each other at events. Goodman, though, was a publisher of pulp magazines. And then when comic books, and specifically superheroes, became popular, he got into that business, and he hired Joe Simon and Jack Kirby to be his editor and art director, respectively. And also, those are the guys who co-created Captain America, which was Goodman's biggest hit. So Stan came to work. Next, please. This is Stan in the Army, which is maybe a little bit out of sequence, but sorry about that. But this is Stan around the age he was when he came to work for Timely. And Stan, you can see, was doing posters. He did his most famous VD Not Me poster in the Army, and he was supposedly one of the 8 or 9 people categorized as playwrights. And although he didn't, I don't think he knew them, it was also William Saroyan and a few other people had that same categorization. So this is Stan, I guess, in around 42, 43. Next, please. So this is what the slide I should have gotten to. Captain America had just, the first issue had just come out the week in December 1940, when Stan had come to work at Timely as an assistant to Simon and Kirby. A lot of the stuff they did was packaged by an outside company called Funnies Inc., but they were doing some stuff in-house and with freelancers. And this was a very bold move by Goodman and by Timely. It was Captain America punching Hitler a full year before Pearl Harbor. I think a lot of it had to do with Lee and Kirby and Martin Goodman being these Jewish guys in the publishing business who, as much or more than anybody, saw what a threat Hitler was going to be. He wasn't exactly keeping it a secret. Kristallnacht had already happened, but certainly advocating pretty much for America to enter the war was a big deal here, say a full year before Pearl Harbor. Next, please, Ben. And this, in issue number 3 of Captain America, which came out in early 1941, was Stan's first published work, and also the first time that Stanley Martin Lieber used the name Stan Lee. This was kind of a way to give Stan something to do besides just erasing stray pencil marks and going out for coffee. Every comic book had to have 2 pages of text to qualify for a discount rate in mailing and shipping. And I don't think they paid a whole lot of attention, so they had Stan write this short 2-page text Captain America story. So, and aside from being Stan's first published work, it's also got an illustration by Jack Kirby, so it's technically the first collaboration between Lee and Kirby. Next, please. Stan worked as an assistant, and Simon and Kirby left after about a year. They had a dispute with Goodman over promised royalties. You will see this was as you probably know, an ongoing pattern in the comic book industry. But while Stan was there, he did a lot of writing. He co-created characters, including the Destroyer. I think the artist was Al Avison, but I'm not sure. But Stan worked on a lot of characters, both in the superhero, next please, and also they did a lot of funny animal books and a lot of humor books, a lot of stuff, adapted or imitated from what was popular on the radio. So Ziggy Pig and Silly Seal was something he co-created with Al Jaffe, and who, yes, same Al Jaffe from Mad Magazine, who did the Fold-In, the Mad Fold-In, and the Snappy Answers to Stupid Questions, and who recently, just last month, turned 99 and is still with us. So this was the wide variety of stuff, and this is just, you know, as much as they may be known for superheroes, they did all sorts of other genres. Next, please. After Stan got out of the Army, a guy named Vince Fago had filled in for him, but then Stan came back, and the company expanded. Comics were very popular. They were really popular with GIs during the war and with children, boys and girls. And at this period, this is 1947, Timely, Atlas, they were still called Timely then, were publishing 75 or 80 titles a month in every genre. You know, superheroes were actually fading. Funny animal, westerns, horror, crime. And Stan, who never actually smoked, but figured if he was going to have an author photo on the cover of Writer's Digest, it should be that, wrote this article called There's Money in Comics, which was actually noticed by and referenced in a not too complimentary manner by Marshall McLuhan in a book that he wrote called The Mechanical Bride. But here's Stan as a celebrity, and there's his original hairline, in case you're wondering what his hairline looked like. Next, please. This is an artist named Ken Bald, who did a lot of work for Timely and Timely/Atlas. He would also go on to do the Dark Shadows newspaper strip, Dr. Kildare, and then he went into advertising, where at that point the real money was. But Stan liked to surround himself with good-looking people, and Ken Bald is pretty much has those movie star good looks. They're in a famous nightclub of the early 50s called Leon and Eddie's in Manhattan. That's Kay Bald next to Stan, and she was an actress and a model. Next to her is Joan Lee, Stan's wife, and there's Stan. So this is about 1952. And Ken Bald and the Balds and the Lees stayed close friends. Even after Ken left the business, they stayed friends through all their lives, you know, until, you know, Ken died, I think, shortly after Stan. Also, he was like 98. But this was, you know, this was not just a work friendship. This was a close relationship that went on and on. This Stan's hair starting to go there. Next, please. This is, you know, later in the 50s. Probably somebody could tell you exactly what month, because those were the comics on sale that month. And that's Stan again. You know, Marvel. There's this myth that Marvel was a tiny company, and it did become that in the late 50s. But until then, they put out, as I was saying, 80 or so titles a month. And so Stan had many other editors working for him. Al Jaffe was one of them. a guy named Leon Lazarus. He had freelancers including um, Jerry Robinson, most famous for creating the Joker and working on Batman. Anyway, this was sort of the heyday of Marvel before everything went to hell. Next, please. This was, you know, when EC Comics was famous for their horror comics and their crime comics. Timely, which was also known as Atlas at this point, was famous not so much as innovators, but as great imitators. So if EC was putting out 2 crime comics or 2 horror comics, Timely would put out 10 of each. You know, Goodman's strategy, not just with comics, but he had a whole line of magazines of what were called men's sweat magazines and adventure magazines. Kind of, they were very schlocky but popular, and they were Hollywood True Confessions and so on. This was one of them, but this was one Stan wrote all the stories for like its first 8 issues. So he was very proud of this, and the voice was developing inside the comics that would become recognizable as that voice of Marvel. But again, this was just one of the many genres that the comic worked on, that the company worked on. They tried reviving superheroes in the 50s very briefly, but I think really superheroes, the only ones that were popular were Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman, and those were pretty much DC's. Next, please. So now, in between that last slide and this slide, Marvel, that's when Frederick Wertham got involved, and other people were very critical of comics. They accused them of causing juvenile delinquency and illiteracy and every other evil that afflicted the country. And so the company, and then Martin Goodman changed his distribution model. We can talk about that later if anybody wants to. And suddenly the company imploded. Even though sales were pretty good, they suddenly went from 75 or 80 titles a month to 8 titles a month. And they were doing comics like Tales to Astonish that had the characters, the most famous, of course, because of the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, Groot. These were kind of definitely oriented towards children, based on movies like Godzilla, King Kong, Rodan. The monster movies of the late 50s, early 60s all had kind of radiation-based origins. And this was where the character Groot came from. Groot was created by Stan and his brother Larry Lieber, who at that point was working as a writer and artist, and the artist by Jack Kirby and Dick Ayers. Next, please. We'll flip ahead for a minute to 2013. This was a Wizard World convention at Basketball City in Manhattan. And that's Larry Lieber on the left, Stan in the middle, who somehow miraculously regained his hairline from his 20s, and Ken Bald, who's still pretty damn good looking in his 90s. So I just wanted to, there seemed no particularly good place to show all these guys. So here they are years later. Next, please. Marvel started getting attention in the media. Stan realized that it was, that there were kind of high-profile fans like Jerry Bales and Roy Thomas. And they started this club called the Merry Marvel Marching Society. So this is Stan being visited in the Marvel Madison Avenue offices, I think it's 1966, by the members of the Princeton University Whig Cliosophic Philosophic Society. And the 2 guys, the second from the left and the one next to Stan on the right, are brothers who I've actually recently been in touch with. They were the Tulenko brothers. And they both had interesting careers later on, but this, was again a pivotal moment in their lives. There's that bust of Stan's wife Joan on the window, done by a artist, I forget his first name, named Sawyer, though. It was the father of a guy named Arnie Sawyer, some of you may know or know of. But this was sort of what Stan kind of both, he realized there was this audience that wasn't just kids, that it was college students, and they were passionate about Marvel in a tongue-in-cheek but very serious way, and he really started cultivating an audience like that, you know, which was, I think, very enjoyable for him and for them, and it helped build that Marvel brand. And really, it helped. I think Stan figured, how long could this last anyway? Let me just build as many bridges everywhere I can, so that when this whole thing implodes, like it usually does every 10 years, I'll have somewhere to go. Next, please. A little bit later, you can see this is maybe one of the first of Stan's toupees. Apparently, this isn't in my book because I only found it out afterwards, but he had 4 different toupees, so it would look like his hair was growing in naturally. So this is one of the toupees, and Stan with, I think that's one of the early Jim Steranko Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. stories. And that's, again, somewhere in the Marvel offices of the 60s. They were no longer called Timely or Atlas. They were called Marvel, but they were still limited to an average of 8 monthly books. Next, please. That Roy Thomas had already come to work there. It looks like early in Roy's Marvel career, he's still wearing a tie to work. And so is Stan. Stan has the beard now. This is probably in the maybe 66 or so. Again, you could probably tell by looking at whatever the cover date on the comics on the desk, but that's Stan and Roy, Roy became the next editor after Stan. Next, please. This is Stan after giving a talk at I think at somewhere out in the island, Long Island or New Jersey. You know, again, enjoying this celebrity. It is funny, you know, because a question I had, and the people sometimes ask me is, you know, Stan was, you know, was a famous celebrity going to college campuses in the 60s and 70s. Did he ever have any affairs with, you know, with female students or teachers? And I think this is the answer. Whether he wanted to or not, this was his audience. These were not people he was going to have affairs with. So whatever his intentions, and I think he was very faithful and loyal to Joan. I don't think this was the group of people that were going to lead him astray from his marriage. But I love this picture. It's sort of, you know, Stan being Stan. Next, please. And this is a picture that they sent out to a lot of fans. Judging by the comics on the wall, I'd say it's around 1968 or so. And here's Stan being a celebrity. Marvel had finally been released from its restrictive distribution agreement. So Doctor Strange now has his own comic, and other characters did. So they kind of doubled the line very quickly. And Martin Goodman had either was about to or just sold the company to a company called Cadence, but Goodman was still sticking around running the company. So Stan is still here, technically editor, or what you call editor-in-chief, although I don't think that was the title, but definitely becoming celebrity Stan more and more. Next, please. And this is probably, I think, around 1976, where he's fully in the blooming of his celebrity mode, where he's promoting razor blades, which I don't know if that's why he shaved his beard, but he's, some of you may remember seeing this. And, you know, it's called him Stan Lee, publisher, Marvel Comics. So at this point, I guess Goodman had sold the company. Stan, and although Goodman had been promised that his son Chip would become the publisher, Stan threatened to resign, and so at this point was the publisher, and Roy Thomas was editor-in-chief. And Stan, who was a natural-born ham, his first ambition had been to be an actor, and he was in the WPA actors group during the Depression. Gets here to promote Persona Blades. I made me create a new character, Persona Man. So next, please. I want to just get a little more, you know, just to sort of show the different kind of things. because I think somebody, I think David Kasakov, when he interviewed me, had asked me, um, what was the first Marvel comic I read? And really, while I was the first, Marvel superhero comic was Fantastic Four #4, I was reading Millie the Model in the barbershop. Back in the day, they'd have comics in the barbershop so kids wouldn't squirm around or get too bored. And I didn't know it was Stan Lee, and this was what Stan loved to do. And this is sort of part of what made Marvel successful, was all these other genres that Stan worked in Western and horror and light romance and comedy. So Millie the Model was definitely part of Marvel's evolution and my own. Next, please. And this is even there at Millie the Model, they were breaking the fourth wall. There's Stan and Stan Goldberg, who looks like his neck is broken. I don't think it was, but they were the team on one of the teams on Millie the Model. So many of you have asked to see the two clever young men who write and illustrate the Millie magazines. Stan is at least 40 here. And so here they are, scriptwriter S. Lee and artist Stan G. Aren't they cute? But Clicker doesn't have to be jealous because, they're both married. Next, please. And then again, here's Millie and her rival Chili, or I guess just Chili, visiting the Marvel offices and going to see Stan Lee and Stan G. And if Marvel was famous for kind of breaking that invisible fourth wall, or whatever you want to call it, between the creators and the characters, they were doing it even this early. Next, please. And of course, you can see that kind of romantic, light comedy look that Stan Goldberg was doing there, translated eventually into Spider-Man, where after Ditko left and John Romita Sr. took over, and Romita had gone from working at Timely at Atlas with Stan in the 50s. He'd gone on to do romance comics at DC, and then Stan talked him into coming back, even though he was on the verge of taking a high-paying job in the ad industry. And he added again this kind of hodgepodge of genres that made Marvel stand out. And this, of course, is one of the most famous Marvel panels ever. Peter's Aunt May has been trying to get him to have a blind date with Mary Jane Watson, and he's been resisting it because he's sure she's going to be dull and plain and not worth going out with. And he's got a crush on Gwen Stacy and Betty Brant. And then, of course, the door opens and face it, Tiger, you just hit the jackpot. But of course, not forgetting that it's a superhero comic, Stan makes sure to mention right next to that, next to Rhino on the Rampage, just so you don't think that it is a romance comic, plus a swinging surprise or two. Next, please, Ben.